Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Socialism is no longer a dirty word. In fact, it's almost de rigueur, especially medical socialism or socialized medicine, whichever way you want to call it. It's now on vogue, particularly in the US. And who's better to talk about this? Let us know if it's a good idea or a bad idea than Dr. Shawn Whatley, who's a returning guest on the show, who's a physician in private practice in Ontario, Canada, and is the past president of the Ontario Medical Association and a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute for Public Policy in Toronto. Dr. Watley wrote two books. The first one was the subject of our previous conversation, No More Lethal Weights, 10 Steps to Transform Canada's Emergency Departments. Sorry about the background noise here. But now, more recently, his latest book, When Politics Comes Before Patients, Why and How Canadian Medicare is Failing. Shawn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be back.
Oh, we're delighted to have you back. I started reading your book. I'm halfway through it. It's fantastic. It really,
Great. You
really
haven't
is
been
good. So, what I love about this book is that, and you talk about this at the beginning, is that you can talk about healthcare at many different levels. You can get into the nitty gritty of the patient experience and what they encounter and criticize that. You can talk about policy and whatnot and so forth. But you're after the fundamental worldview, right? The fundamental issues. Tell us about what motivated you to write this book.
Oh, Michelle, I'm so glad that you went straight for that four-level categorization because this is where I think the money is. We love to talk about care and coordination of care, and that makes sense, right? People want to talk about what happened at the bedside, and that's where we spend our lives as physicians, right? We're at the bedside talking about the nitty-gritty bits and pieces of care. And then one level below that is coordination of care, and that's the level that our administrators work at, and our hospital people who run the hospital, that sort of thing. Care, coordination of care, but we need to go two layers deeper. So care, coordination, culture. Culture is simply what we decide is normal wherever we work. So if you work someplace that starts meetings 5 minutes late all the time, that's the culture at your workplace. It's just a collection of the norms and behaviors where you live and work. Within socialized medicine, and we'll unpack that word socialized in about 2 seconds as well, but within socialized medicine, there's a normal way of making decisions, and we need to understand what that's like. And culture then rests on a set of ideas. So, for example, if your workplace starts meetings late, it means you don't value punctuality. Or maybe you think it's much more polite to be late because you don't want to be rude to all the people who can't make it there on time. A whole whack of ideas live at the concept level. Same thing for socialized medicine. You need to have an essentially benign view of government. You need to believe that teams provide better care than individuals. And there's a whole group of concepts that feed into the norms of decision making at the concept or at the cultural level. So I'm glad that you jumped for that. I mean, that is where the money is, I think. But if you have a moment, I'd love to talk about the word socialism too, because I don't want people to think we're being rude.
Go for it. Go for it. I
Okay,
think it's
really.
important, and we may as well define our terms, right, in order to have a constructive argument.
Brilliant. So I'm so glad. So I love to talk about Jim Carrey. So I know you guys think he's an American comedian, but he's actually started in Canada. We don't want to give him up yet. We own him, right? Crazy man.
You can have him
And
back.
okay. I was just about to say you can keep him, but anyways. so so Jim Carrey was on Bill Maher's show. I'm sure another one of our heroes, right? We watch Bill Maher all the time. I'm just joking. But Jim Carrey was on Bill Maher's show, Real Time with Bill Maher, and Jim Carrey said, "Listen, I'm from Canada, okay, and we have socialized medicine, and I'm here to tell you it's not a failure." And he goes on a long speech saying how good socialized medicine is. And actually, Bernie Sanders has the clip on his website. So if you want to see the whole clip, you can go to Bernie Sanders' website and watch it. But Jim Carrey was not bashful at all about saying, yeah, we have socialized medicine. And a Harris poll from 2019 looked at voters over the age of 38, or sorry, under the age of 38, and found that more than 50% of them would prefer to live in a socialist country. And certainly, on your side of the border, many self-described socialist politicians are extremely popular right now. So I don't think we have to be bashful about using the word socialized when we talk about socialized medicine anymore. I think we can use it as a descriptive term without people just trying to dismiss us as being rude. You'll find that any of the successes people can point to when it comes to Canadian Medicare, they love to use the term socialized medicine to talk about the successes. But if you talk about failures, they get really mad at you if you use the word socialized medicine when you're talking about the failures.
Right. No, very good. Well, then how? Um, so we're going to talk about socialized medicine. In I Interestingly, in Canada, it's tell us about the sort of the historical connotations of the term. Was there ever initially tiptoeing around using the term socialized medicine or medical socialism?
Absolutely. And to be perfectly fair, I still haven't defined the term socialized medicine or what
Right.
we mean by that word socialized. And it's really, really important to unpack it. Um, Canada lives on this myth. And in fact, you even used the term at the front. You said Shawn is in private practice. And that's still a fair term. We still use the term here, but there was a book written by Dr. Naylor, and he's a former dean of the University of Toronto, and it was called Public Payment Private Practice, or maybe it's Private Practice Public Payment. It's on the shelf right behind me. I can pull it off the shelf if you want. But there's this myth of private practice and public payment. It's the perfect gestalt of the two, and you can do whatever you want in your private practice, and the government will just pay for it all, and everybody's happy. And that's kind of how things started in the early 1970s, right? It was an insurance plan. Actually, over 60% of the Canadian population already had a form of medical insurance in the late 1960s. And so docs weren't all that worried about insurance per se. They thought, well, it seems to work well. All of the plans in Canada at that point were run and organized by physicians because physicians knew that the government was going towards a socialized medicine approach. And so when it came in 1968, and finally by 1972, it was from coast to coast, doctors weren't all that upset about it because, hey, now we were getting paid for 100% of our bills as
Mhm.
opposed to only 67% of our bills before. They used to provide a lot of care for free. So like Aneurin Bevan said, I think Anish said this on our last interview. He referred to Aneurin Bevan saying, how did you ever get the docs to agree? And he said, I stuffed their mouths with gold.
Right.
And that's exactly what happens with every government program. They stuff your mouth with gold. You can't resist. Everybody's happy until the money runs out. And the money ran out in Canada in 1977. So the initial promise was that the federal government enticed the provinces to build these state plans, provincial plans, by promising to pay for 50% of whatever the provinces spent. Well, that was a blank check. So all the politicians built hospitals in every little community. We had more beds than sick people to fill them. And so you never asked, there was never a wait for anything. It's just like we had all the capacity you could imagine. We were the envy of the world, but we couldn't pay for it. So in 1977, the first Prime Minister Trudeau said, wait a second, no more blank checks. Forget this 50% free ticket
Mhm.
uh, gamble that we have. We're going to block funding. And so they then moved to just set amounts. We're going to give you X number of dollars. And we can get into the calculation. To be honest with you, I can't remember exactly the percentage details, but the concept was 50% of whatever you want to spend changing to a block transfer. And that was in 1977 with the Established Programs Financing Act. Well, now the provinces were on the hook for all the growth and spending. And so from 1977 forward, you saw the provinces scrambling to decrease the number of services and cut beds and cut services. And then they started adding hospital user fees, and a very small fraction of the physicians started to bill extra billing that the the media slimed it. They said, "Oh, this is extra billing." Docs called it balanced billing because the province had promised to raise fees as inflation increased. Well, what the provinces didn't have the money to pay for it anymore, so they refused to raise the fees in line with inflation. So some docs said, "Well, okay, well, I'll raise. I need to charge you $5 for that service because the government wouldn't pay for it." So there was this thing known as extra billing, according to the media, anyways. And so because of those two things, then in the early 1980s, 1984, the federal government, there's a whole story behind that too. It was actually a bait to get the conservatives to fight against Medicare, and it failed. Conservatives said, well, we'll support this Canada Health Act that the first Prime Minister Trudeau put forward. Canada Health Act comes in and they say no more of this hospital user fees and extra billing. And so since 1984, we've been locked in, nothing outside of Medicare, everything within inside of Medicare, and individual provinces have then gone on and
Hmm.
made care outside of the provincial systems illegal. So
Right.
hopefully that's a data dump for you, maybe
Yeah,
too
no,
much.
it sounds good. But so you describe how things didn't go as planned and whatnot. But is there or was there what's the animating principle, the big slogan, the big idea that everybody feels warm and fuzzy about when they think about Canada's Medicare system?
Great question. Care regardless of ability to pay.
Okay.
You get care regardless of ability to pay. Everybody gets the same care. We're very fair. We're very equal, which we know is not true. It's actually, if you're poor, you get much less
Hmm.
care because you're not articulate or connected or educated enough to ask for good care. But yeah, no, that's the slogan, care regardless of ability to pay.
Right. And that first of all, so I love the parts where you describe how that was sold as a plan, disparaging what had happened before, right? The way care was so as um, insinuating that people were not getting care or poor care, or people were going home or being turned away from hospitals or from doctors' offices and that
Yes.
sort of thing.
Yes.
You have the story about this
Tommy
uh,
Douglas.
Tommy Douglas. Yeah, tell us a little bit about Tommy Douglas, because I think this is very important. It's so the way you describe it is extremely clever, because Tommy Douglas's arguments in favor of socialized medicine seemed extremely compelling
Yes.
until you dissect them, and then you analyze exactly what they mean or what they imply,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. So Tommy Douglas, I should say, I believe he's the uncle of Kiefer Sutherland. So
Oh, is
the
that right?
South,
A little, okay.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
because the Sutherlands are related to Tommy Douglas, and so when my mom saw that I wrote this, she said, "Oh my gosh, Shawn, he's related to the Sutherlands. They might get you in trouble on media or something, and go on TV." I said, "Mom, that would be awesome. Then we would sell lots of books. That would." so, so, yeah, Tommy Douglas, and every sort of idea that holds a country together needs a defining myth, right? You need a story, the hardy pioneer or the cowboy riding off or the whatever, right? And so for Medicare, our defining myth is this myth about Tommy Douglas's leg. When Tommy Douglas was a young boy, I'll be very short about it, but he fell and hurt his leg in Scotland and he got osteomyelitis, so infection in the bone. He had a few surgeries in Falkirk, Scotland, immigrated to Canada around the early 1900s, 1904, I believe, or maybe he was born in 1904 and came in 1906. But around that time, the osteomyelitis came back. He ended up getting admitted to Children's Hospital in Winnipeg. Now, Winnipeg was a booming town at the early 20th century, much like Chicago. It was sort of a center of industry. Everybody came and went through Winnipeg. They had a very robust medical community as far as you could have in those days. They had a college of medicine that had already been there for over 30 years. The Flexner Report had reviewed the medical school in Manitoba. As you remember, the Flexner report reviewed medical schools all across North America and tried to shut down the
Hmm.
bad ones or limit the number of docs that were being pumped out. And it got a passing grade from the Flexner report. Um, and so we have this situation where Tommy Douglas, his infection recurred. He's in Sick Children's Hospital in Winnipeg, strong medical community there. There's a regulatory college that exists to enforce the standards of practice, punish people, take away their license if they don't practice within the standards of medicine. And this was the environment that Tommy was in. And he was in hospital for 18 months, multiple surgeries. And finally, he got to a point, and the way Tommy Douglas tells it, he said, my doctors couldn't do anymore. And they were going to have a talk with my mom and dad about amputation. So he said, I was going to lose my leg. But he said, only because Dr. Smith walked by and was compassionate on me. He took my case on for free as long as my students could, as long as his students could watch. And he said he saved my leg. He said I came to understand, right? This is 1960s now. Fast forward over half a century, 1960s. He said I came to the conviction that no boy, you can watch his lectures on TV, his political speeches. He started out as a Baptist preacher. He was very, lots of fire and
Uh-huh.
brimstone. No boy should lose his leg or his life, or no boy should fear for his leg or his life. He should be able to, and you can hear the crowds. Everybody's all excited. And it makes total sense, right?
Right.
Why should a boy, a 9-year-old boy, I think he was 9 or 10 at the time, worry about losing his leg when he didn't need to, or his life when he didn't need to, just because his parents were poor? I mean, how could we let that happen? How could a civilized country allow that to happen? This is terrible. And all the voters would agree, yeah, this is terrible. So that bugged me for years. I just thought, what did I train in? What kind of a profession is this where my orthopedic colleagues would amputate kids when they knew the kid didn't need an amputation? What the heck's going on? So it started a very long process of digging into all the policy pieces. And to be clear, this myth of Tommy's leg shows up in every single book. I have dozens of them on the shelf behind me. They invariably reference Tommy Douglas. Tommy Douglas had an infected leg, and it led him to lead the charge for socialized medicine. And so I started talking to, I believe it was around 10 docs who practiced in the 1950s and 60s. And so there are very few that actually are still alive or cognizant nowadays, at least the ones that I could find. And I asked them, I said, well, so what happened when people couldn't pay? They said, well, we just provided care for them. And I said, well, there's this idea out there that, if people couldn't pay, they would die or they would lose their leg. They didn't get surgery. And a number of the docs got very angry with me. And they said, where'd you hear that? I said, well, I'm reading all these books. Well, what kind of books are you reading? They were really, really angry. And they said, a number of them remembered very accurately. They said, we only collected 67% of our billings on a good year in the late 50s and 60s. And so I started digging into the literature, and you can actually find data to support that on a more broad scale. In the depression years, actually, collection rates were down in the 50% range. So doctors did an awful lot of work for free. So I asked them, well, that was just in your clinic then. What about the hospital? No, same thing. What about the emergency? Same thing. What
Hmm.
about surgery? Same thing. Doctors provided the care that patients needed. If someone came, they would provide the care. They did not let people lose their leg or their life. And of course, you guys know the first rule in, advanced ATLS or ACLS courses, life and limb, right? You save life and limb. This is like a core mantra in medicine around the world. And Tommy Douglas took aim directly at that and said, you guys cared about money more than life and limb. And he also gave the impression that doctors only provide care if they get money first, which is totally wrong. If anything, it's more like a restaurant. You provide the care and then hopefully you get paid afterwards. right? You feed the customer and hopefully the customer will pay you.
Right.
And so I go through all of those assumptions and say, not only is this a terrible moral accusation that you're telling me docs would amputate the leg of an otherwise healthy boy who didn't need to lose his leg simply because his parents were too poor to pay. And the evidence doesn't fit from
Right.
the college, from the medical community, the fact that he had almost 2 years of free care already, if it was free, from the fact that no one else at the time did this sort of thing. It was standard to provide care and not get paid for it. The standard of practice is to refer. So Dr. Smith wasn't just a kind surgeon that came around. He was most likely an academic surgeon who said, "Oh yeah, you guys have tried everything. Well, actually, maybe I have a couple of experimental techniques I'd like to try, and I'd like my residents to watch too, because this is kind of cutting edge things." So I actually presented this to the Ottawa Capital Region Orthopedic Association, and they said, yeah, no, that makes a heck of a lot more sense than what Tommy Douglas said. But as far as I know, I haven't seen anyone dig into his story and say, okay, what are the implications of what you just said? And so I appreciate you asking me
Yeah,
to talk
I
about
think
it.
it's really terrific because on the surface, when you read it casually, you read a story casually, it sort of makes sense. You know, we're imbued with this idea that you also mentioned it in your book. This Homo economicus idea, the rational self-interest, that each one of us is after our own interest, and therefore doctors are out there to maximize their profits, and therefore then it makes sense that they would, they wouldn't treat people who can't pay, and they would which is a complete it's another myth, right? But it's a myth that is commonly accepted when you want the government to intervene, right? When you want the
Yes.
government to take over the course of things.
Yes, so that term "homo economicus," in case some of the viewers don't know it, it's reducing um, men and women to nothing but their desire to make more money, and it comes from so Karl Marx was a big promoter of historical materialism, which is really a focus on only thing that matters in life is if you can get enough material, in this case money, so that you can get food and clothing and shelter. And that's the most important thing in society. All the rest is just superstructure. It's essentially less important than the core material realities, and everything else is about power structures and class
Mhm.
in order to get more of this core material. So we make the assumption that doctors must be like that too, and therefore doctors must only be motivated by increasing their material position in life, their material self-interest. So therefore, when it comes to patient care, that must be the only thing motivating doctors. But even today, we have people coming to my emergency department who do not have valid coverage because they're from Quebec and Quebec never pays for it, or you can send a bill to Quebec but Quebec won't pay, or they're traveling, or they're Americans, or they're no ID on them, and you don't know where they're from, and you don't not provide care. Like, you do what the patient needs, and in fact you would be found to be negligent if you didn't. And there are laws against not providing care. Like, you have to care for people who are going to lose their leg or their life, and they're in front of you. But no one has stopped to say, wait a second, Mr. Douglas, this is what you're saying, and that doesn't fit with reality.
Right, correct. So instead, there's this idea that we need these large programs, socialized medicine programs, to provide more equal, right, to equalize how the care is provided. So it's not just the rich who receive the care and the doctors who enrich themselves, but that there's a process of equalizing, you know, the material goods, so to speak, so that it's more fair.
Yes.
Um, you mentioned, uh, but you flip this around a little bit, because I want to read a passage that it really struck me. I thought it was really extremely clever and very insightful. You don't deny that in the free market, if you will, that there's actually in medicine that equalities arise. In fact, you say that treating sick people creates massive inequality because doctors and nurses employ extravagant access to help the sick,
Yes.
right? Who may only benefit a little, and medicine drives doctors to excess, right?
Yes.
So the doctors go beyond, to treat the individual in front of them,
Yes.
right? Because they are concerned about the individual, and therefore they're going to put all the resources that are, you know, humanly available to them. I mean, they're not going to steal from others, and presumably, but they're going
Yes.
to do put a lot of resource to try to help an individual, and it may not succeed, and therefore, in that sense, it does create a lot of inequality. Um, as opposed to what happens when you have a socialized solution, right? Which you says, that's the opposite. It's a utilitarian distribution of care that will allegedly benefit the most people,
Yes.
right?
So we are motivated by priority,
Uh-huh.
and socialized medicine is motivated by or animated by equity, equal outcomes. And so, actually, there are a number of fundamental divides between medicine and socialized medicine or state medicine. And so, since we're starting with priority versus equality, we can think of the fundamental ethics behind a medical practice versus public health. So we'll geek out for a second here.
Mhm.
Medicine is motivated by a normative deontological ethic. So, in other words, duty. We have a duty to provide care. Whereas in public health, they're motivated by a consequentialist ethic or utilitarianism. How can we do the most good for the most people? Let's lock down Toronto. Let's lock
Mhm.
down San Francisco,
We'll
right?
talk about that in a moment.
We'll
Yeah,
talk
I'm
about
sure.
that later.
Yeah.
So so fundamentally different. And within that, we as physicians again are focused on the individual in front of us. So we have that normative deontological ethic or the duty to provide care to the individual in front of us. The state is motivated by a consequentialist ethic, utilitarian. How can we help the most people at once? We're focused on individuals. The state is focused on populations. We're focused on providing care. How can we provide care for this patient? The state is focused on distribution of care. Does everybody get a bit of care? And regulating that care. So, distribution and regulation versus provision. We focus on care. Government focuses on payment for care. Fundamentally different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Payment versus actual medicine. What does the person need? And then finally, we focus on legal risk. We don't want to get involved with the law, get sued. It's bad enough if we feel we've made a mistake that'll destroy a person. But on top of that, you end up getting sued. The the government is worried about political risk, and political risk and legal risk often have nothing to do with each other. Government's very happy to ration the amount of care available, increase my legal risk by having to work in an overcrowded system, and they don't really care. They say, well, Whatley, you still should choose wisely and not order too many tests. And so there's fundamental divide on multiple levels there.
Right. No, that's very, very insightful and very well said in your book. So the doctors are focused on providing the doctors, the hospitals, in their natural state of affair, are focused on providing the provision of care as opposed to the distribution of care. But the distribution of care implies that people, governments, bureaucrats, whoever's in charge of the province or state or this, knows where to distribute it and how to allocate it and to what end and how can they know that, right?
So I'm speaking to a Hayekian here who's
Yeah,
published multiple articles on epistemic humility and Hayek's knowledge problem. So that and I apologize if I was too simplistic when I talked about Hayek in the book, but exactly to your point, there's no way that a group of very, very smart people, even if we had a cat and coca in running the government 1,000 miles away from the bedside where I'm trying to help this individual, you will never know as well as I will know about the patient in front of me. So you could make what seems like a rational decision for how many CT scanners we need in a particular area, or whether or not we need X, Y, and Z therapy.
Mhm.
But it's it at best, it will come to guesswork. And I think even the left and the right across the political spectrum has admitted that Hayek's knowledge problem holds for government, and it feeds into public choice theory and the theory of government failure. But the response to it is they say, well, what else can we do? We've got to still try to control this. So they
Right.
continue doing their central command and
Right.
control.
Right. And then they can't, and then there's a blame game that goes around. You blaming the doctors, blaming this, blaming that, for a situation where you see, commonly people being treated in hallways and long wait lists that are notorious by now, and so forth. And then there's a migration of physicians from Canada to the US. I mean, this is no longer new and perhaps not as robust as it used to be, but nevertheless, I mean, we've experienced that. And then a migration of patients from Canada to elsewhere to seek the care that they cannot get, and so forth.
Yeah.
And you describe all of this in detail, but nevertheless, there is there's the fact that to this day, and you acknowledge it, that Medicare, Canadian Medicare, remains quite popular publicly. It's a sort of a, I mean, there's a pride in having this myth, if you will, whether you believe in it or not believe in it. There's a pride in Canadian Medicare. Um, how do you explain that? And then beyond that, how do you overcome it? I mean, your book is one way of trying to overcome it, but how do you explain the persistence of the popularity of the Medicare program in Canada?
So only 4% of the population ever needs to be admitted to acute care in any given year. So
Mm-hmm.
96% of us are allowed to live on the myth, and we never know that the myth is a myth until we actually need it.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, the people that end up with the worst treatment are often very, very sick old people. And if they survive, they're just happy to be alive. And then
Right.
on top of that, we have this whole cottage industry based on boosting that myth. So I hear on radio shows all the time, just like Jim Carrey, I'm so sick and tired of hearing about all these people complaining about it is great. Let me tell you, I got
Mm-hmm.
great care. I got my heart surgery and I got my breast cancer fixed. And I use the analogy in the book that's like people who were rescued into one of the life rafts when the Titanic sank, and they're all snuggled up in their blanket and they're eating crackers, and strong sailors are rowing them to safety, and they say, what are you guys complaining about? I look at how good our system is. I got saved, and meanwhile there's people dying in the water all around them.
Right.
And and it sounds like over the top, but that's exactly what's happening. We know that people are dying. We know that we had over 1 million people on wait lists before this. People are using their own money to try to put up with the waits. Like, they're not using their own money to get care. They're doing that as well. Several 100,000 people a year leave Canada to get care in the States. But just the fact that you're sitting on a wait list is an enormous expense. Anyways, you were going to say something. I
Yeah.
better
No,
stop.
that's right. I mean, I think, but there may be a pernicious psychological phenomenon that uh, goes, and I think you allude to that as well. Is that if you're not paying for it, you feel that it's hard for you to complain, right? I mean, since, or at least it seems that you're not paying for it, right? It's paid for sort of magically by, I don't know how much money the Canadian government prints, but certainly there's a lot of taxation going on. So, but nevertheless, it's sort of collectivized. So you're not personally paying for it. So you may be feeling out of place, trying to complain about that system, especially if you've encountered it or benefited from, maybe you're going to be on a waiting list to get your knee replaced for 6 months or so, but since you're not paying for it, it's going to dampen your
Enthusiasm for
enthusiasm for
change.
complaining, for change, or for
Yeah.
complaining, or
Well, most people, I mean, what have you, I won't ask you for your personal health details, but I mean, what have you needed? What have your kids needed? I mean, most people, okay, I get a little cut, I go get it fixed. I twist my
right.
ankle. Hey, I got my ankle. Oh, my blood pressure's a bit high. I just go to the clinic. This guy makes me wait too long. Hopefully I can find another family doctor and she's fast and she runs on time. Great. I'm going to try to get in there to that
Hmm.
practice. And so for all these little things, sort of the, the not too major issues, Oh, it's not perfect. The magazines are out of date and the place is shabby, but hey, I didn't have to pay for it. So what are you complaining about? Just put up with it. We need to measure our system by how we treat our most vulnerable patients. How do we function on the margins? Because that's why the system exists. The system doesn't exist to check your cholesterol when it's only tiny little bit high. Okay, that's wonderful. We'll check it and whoa, whoopee, it's free. No, it's when you really get sick and you're sitting in a hallway and you're dehydrated and now you're getting hydrated and you need to walk to the bathroom because you can't go to the bathroom in the hallway, and you finally get someone's attention and they're running by to help resuscitate someone and they say, whoa, 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 what do you need? You say, I gotta go pee. I gotta go to the
Mhm.
bathroom. And they say, you have a diaper.
Mhm.
And so just unpack this. And this has happened to lots of people. And I'm thinking of one gentleman in particular with this story, but just think of what that means. You, an otherwise healthy executive, you're just freshly retired. You ended up with some dehydration. I won't give too many details because I don't want to give away the case. You're now rehydrated. You now have good urine output. And someone says, no, I can't take you because you need someone to push the IV pole, right? Like you can't just carry the IV pole and hold your gown together and hop out of the stretcher and go hunting for the bathroom, although many patients do. So instead they say, well, just pee in your diaper. And then, well, how long are you going to be in the wet diaper for? And where are you going to get cleaned up? And what if it's not
Mhm.
just number one? What if you have to go bowel
Mhm.
movement? Yeah, it just blows your mind, but this is normal. I had one of my friends who's a nurse say, Shawn, I was laughing at you talking about that one story. She said, that's not rare. She said, it happens to hundreds of patients a day. We just say, yeah, you got a diaper, you got a diaper. Don't bug me.
Right.
And people need to know that, I mean, if urinary incontinence is a major issue for a patient, or if they're that sick that they can't get to the bathroom, you put in a catheter. You don't tell them that you have a diaper. And so that's just one example. I can give you another example. One of my patients, she's passed away now. She was elderly, but her husband, both of these were basically healthy until the end. They got something major and passed away, the husband and wife. But the husband went first, and he ended up with a hemorrhagic stroke. And so, as you've probably seen many of these patients, they tend to roll to one side or they favor one side. And so he's lying on a stretcher in the emergency department. They had no pillows left. They had no blankets left. And this fellow, he was on a chair and he kept falling off the chair. So they realized, okay, we got to get this guy on a stretcher, put him on the stretcher. And he kept rolling into the guardrails of the stretcher, the metal bars, old fashioned stretchers, right? And he'd be pressing his face right into these bars. And she said, Dr. Whatley, the wife is telling me this story of his final hour. She said, I couldn't pull him off the bars. She said, I kept trying to pull him, but he was too strong for me. And she said, I just wanted, there was no porter. There was no one who could come and help. There were no pillows to put between his face and the bar. So, I mean, and these are just two stories. I could tell
Right.
you story after story. We have lost the moral high ground on our ability to provide everyone care regardless of ability to pay, and we've lost the moral high ground on how we treat patients. And the thing, and then I'm going to end with this, the thing that makes it heinous is that someone made the decision to allow the system to be this way. Justice Marie Deschamps in the Supreme Court decision 2005, the Julie case, where they challenged whether or not patients could get insurance for hip surgery. It was in Quebec, outside of the public plan. And the Supreme Court actually ruled that, yes, you can. So the government said, okay, you can have insurance, but only for hip surgery, no insurance for anything else. All the rest has to be with the state. But Marie Deschamps said that so wait times in the Medicare system are real and intentional. So we've got better at talking about the reality of the wait times, but we are not even scraping the surface of the intentionality of those wait times. Someone planned those, and they have to plan them. The UK went through the same thing in the 1960s with the National Health Service. They gave the impression to the public that we will provide your care when you need it. But they have to ration somewhere. You can't have first dollar coverage and just an empty open buffet, eat all you want, without someone controlling either the size of the plates or the portion what that's out there, or the opportunity of what you get, what services you can access. So someone has to ration somewhere. The way we do it in Canada, same way they did it in the United Kingdom, is we ration it like a soup kitchen. Someone rations from behind the counter. And so the customers don't know who to blame. Well, it's the doctor's fault. He's the gatekeeper. He's not giving me my CT, my MRI. And then you get this attitude of entitlement, and you have to fight to make sure your doc is giving you all you really deserve. And so, no, I need another referral for anterior knee pain. You guys aren't orthopods, but anterior knee pain drives the ortho guys nuts. Like, don't send me an anterior knee pain, right? There's just nothing I can do for them. Or a third MRI of your
Right.
shoulder or whatever. And so it breaks down the fundamental fabric of the doctor patient relationship. Anyway, I better stop here,
No, it's
Michelle.
great, but I mean, one answer would be to throw more money at the problem, right? I mean, I think it might be a common response, and maybe temporarily there are temporary influxes of money once in a while to sort of
Yes.
pretend that you can fix this with more money. Um, and but the other way is if you can actually see that it's not, and I think you've alluded to that there's money. I mean, there's no way that even if the money were fixed, that it's really, if it's left to the doctors or people who are really interested in the ultimate care of patients, it would be reallocated much better, right?
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't have, again, all the MRI spent for anterior knees and that sort of thing. I mean, you would know on at the moment how to redistribute. Whereas here you have a bureaucracy. I don't know if it's a bloated bureaucracy, but I imagine there are a fair number of people on the payroll to try to make those decisions behind the scenes, right? Administrators and whatnot. I mean, certainly we have tons of them here on this side of the border, um, and they can't know how to allocate optimally. All they can do is beg for more money and maybe get it from once in a while and that sort of thing.
So you opened up about 6 doors in those comments. That was beautiful. You talked about allocation, you talked about moral hazard, you talked about bureaucracy and bloat, and you talked about payment to save the system. And each one of those are just a brilliant comments. I won't try to answer them all. I'll just make one comment, and I think this will help for the American discussion as well. So as you know, we have a court case in BC. It actually failed at the provincial level, the provincial superior court, I believe it was, and it was 7 plaintiffs. 2 of them actually died waiting for the case, and the Cambie Surgical Center. And so everybody says, "Oh, this is about the Cambie Surgical Center case," but it's actually 5 patients who came to harm from waiting too. And so there are a number of plaintiffs, and they said it was a threat to, I believe, security of the person. It's based on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, and the provincial court said, no, this isn't a strong enough reason for us to allow private insurance. The reason I mention that, and that case is being appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, but even if it wins and the Supreme Court says, okay, you can have private insurance, it's like this. If you go, I have 4 kids, 2 girls, boy, girl. So if I tell if we go to the store, my wife says, hey, pick up some milk, Shawn. And so we go to the store, and I've got my daughter in the car, and I say, hey, Kate, here's my Visa card. Run in and get some milk. And we're at Metro. That's the name of a grocery store here. So my daughter runs in, picks up milk, pays for it, the Visa, and comes back. I've decided where the milk's bought, how much milk is bought, what kind of milk is bought, and how the milk is paid for. I've decided everything. Now, if we change the payment, so let's say I gave her cash instead of Visa. Let's say she paid with food stamps. Let's say I didn't give her enough money, and so she happened to pick out her own money out of her pocket, and then I had to pay her back when she came back. Payment is a minor part of the whole equation if I control all the other features. If I control the location, the amount, the type, the quality, the timing, where she gets it from, I'm the boss. And that's what I'm talking about when we have socialized medicine. So von Mises, you've probably got von Mises on your desk somewhere too. You know his beautiful book on socialism, and he has some great quotes in there. And he says, this blended system or the mixed approach, right? The public payment, private practice, mythological land that doesn't exist anywhere anymore. He said, if someone else can control those fundamental details of your business, you do not own the business in the traditional sense. You may have the title on the lease, but if someone else can control access, when your hours have to be open, how you perform within that system, who you can hire, who you can fire, the hours that they work. I could go on and on and on listing all the heavy regulations that we function under. Then you are by definition in a fully socialized system. And I would argue that in many ways, the environment that you practice in with your HMOs or your large insurance companies
Sure.
become very socialized as well. They
Sure.
start to control all the
Right.
details.
Right. Sure. No, absolutely. And lo and behold, in an environment like this, the physicians become more self-interested. They start acting more like the Homo economicus than they did, previously. It becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts.
Yes, and a lot of the older docs that practiced before Medicare came in, they said the same thing, and they said to me, said quite frankly, they said we loved it when all this insurance came in. We didn't have to collect bills or anything. However, we were shocked at our colleagues how quickly they started to say, "No, I'm not doing that. I'm not getting
Hmm.
paid. You got to
Hmm.
give me $30 at least. That's what we get for an intermediate assessment. You have pneumonia,
Right.
$33, right?" You guys would probably think that's pretty pathetic. Um, but they before they would say, "No, my patient needs it. Well, it's a home. It's a house call. I'm going to go." Um, so there was a change on both sides of that relationship. They would tell me stories about patients who would ask for house calls in the early 1970s just to see if the doctor would come. And one doc said, he said, "Oh yeah, I got a number of them." And they would say, "Well, okay, I'm here. What do you need?" They said, "Oh no, we just wanted to see if you would come. We didn't think it was actually true, this new health insurance plan, right?" and so, and then the doctor would bill for it, right? The government would pay for it. So first dollar coverage,
Right.
soup kitchen, it ends up more and more like a soup kitchen as opposed to the true medical care that we had tried to train in, and it leads to moral injury. Moral injury is when you ask a provider to provide care. I know some people hate the word provider. You ask a clinician, you ask a physician or nurse or tech or respiratory tech to provide care, and you do not give them the resources they need to provide the care that they know they could provide, and they know the patient needs, but they don't have those resources, and yet they're responsible for the outcome of that patient, right? They're held medical legally responsible. It leads to moral injury, which is very similar to PTSD. It's similar to features you see when people are involved in wartime casualty situations as
Right.
well. And we burn out our human resources.
Anish, you've been waiting patiently.
Thanks, Shawn. It was really wonderful. It's always so great to hear you talk. You learn so much. You're clearly such a both you and Michelle are really leading lights in the sense of understanding where we've come from and where we are now. I wonder though if you can perhaps clarify for some in the audience, maybe the minority in the audience who listen to this podcast, who the losers would be in the type of system that you would favor.
So the type of system I would favor would be one that starts with patient care. So start with the doctor-patient relationship and work backwards from there. How do we get great care like the privileged patients get right now? And so it would include things like choice, options. If you don't like the doc you're seeing, then hopefully you can go sign up at a clinic somewhere else. It would probably involve some solution for the issue of moral hazard, where people actually need to feel some skin in the game, but also they need to have a lot more control. The losers in that would be basically every major stakeholder in the system right now. Many doctors would be very frustrated at it. It is painful, painful,
Would
painful, but go ahead,
would
sir.
there would there be any patients that would lose in that system?
And so you'd have to define what system you're talking about. I would advocate for a fully universal system. I know that might give you guys hives, but I don't think there's any excuse to not insist on some method of getting coverage for everybody who wants it. I'm not saying forcing the rich people to get coverage because we're just going to be a collectivist kind of approach. But we have to admit that there are some people in society that need help. And just like you need to have insurance to drive a car on the road, I think to be a citizen in a country, if you've got a job, you should figure out some way to take care of yourself and take care of your family, and not just show up at the emerge with no insurance, no coverage, and say, Anish, I want you to pay for me now, right, with your taxes. So this has been solved around the world over and over and over, whether you have a Beveragian approach with multiple insurance programs, or you have a co-pays, or you have government program only for critical care. I, that the main issue, and the next C I'm going to add to that list, actually in my next book, is context. So whatever you build has to be built within the context of the citizens you're trying to care for. So in the United States, I would probably imagine you'd have something with a greater emphasis on individualism, right? You're John Locke. You love your classical liberalism, radical individualism to the max. I don't need anybody. It's just me. And so build a system around that reflects the values and ideas within the community that you have. Depending on the area of Canada, certainly Alberta would be much more along those lines. You need to be emphasizing the individual, and you could go wherever you want and have coverage or not. Other places in Canada, for example, in Quebec, much more of a communitarian flavor. So maybe they need to have more of a municipal based solution, or perhaps a regional based solution, or maybe the province needs to be the core of the solution. But right now we are locked down, and the provinces are not allowed to innovate because of the Canada Health Act. If they go ahead and they innovate and they try to add any kind of different payment mechanisms, the federal government claws back or threatens to claw back funding from the provinces. I see.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question? Probably not.
No, yeah, no. I was wondering how you would do it, because, yeah, it would seem like the model that perhaps Michelle favors leaves some holes, and you would plug those holes with some type of universal assurance of some basic level of care, basically.
Yeah.
Is that right,
So
Michelle? Yeah. Or is that right, Shawn? Did I paraphrase?
yeah,
Summarize
no,
that?
that's perfect. And I, to be clear, I love Michelle's. I love Hayek as well. And so Hayekian approach is beautiful. I love individualism, and I think we need to allow people to freely contract and all of that. The trouble with
Mich-
that, number one, it depends on the
Michelle,
context.
listen closely. This is why he won't get canceled.
That's right. That's right. So the challenge with that is it doesn't reflect reality for most people, how they live their lives. And second of all, and maybe you guys are going to kill me here now, but healthcare is not a commodity. Just like accounting is not a commodity, legal services are not a commodity. When you need a lawyer or an accountant, you want to know a guy. When you need a plumber, you want to know a guy. You don't say, hey, I need 2 feet of plumbing pipe. Okay, I'm going to go shop from Anish. Oh, yeah, Anish, you sell me the elbow. Okay, Michelle, you sell me the drain siphon down. No, you make a relationship with someone you trust, and you say, okay, can I trust this guy? Yeah, he's a good plumber. Great. Okay, I'm with you now. How do you suggest we go about fixing this leak in my house, or the drain, or the renovation? And so the actual services that you're getting, it's even worse in medicine because you're dealing with a knowledge product. So how do you figure out the price of a surgeon seeing you and telling you you don't need a knee replacement? You don't need anything. You don't need any x-rays. So they saw you to tell you that you need nothing. So you went in with a concern, you left hopefully without a concern. Maybe you still left with a concern. A lot of people leave disgruntled when they hear from the surgeon they don't need anything. And yet the surgeon is now billing for that. And so it gets into what James Wilson calls a coping organization, where you can't see what's happening and you can't see the result of what's happening. In the post office, that's a production organization. You can see the work and you can see the outcome. A procedural organization, you can see the work, but you can't see the outcome. So that's like the army in peacetime. You can see them marching around, but you don't know if they're any good. A craft organization, medicine's like this a lot too. Sometimes you can't see what they're doing, but you see the outcome. So this is like an expert negotiator. You don't know what they're doing when the lawyers are in the room trying to get you more money for your contract, but when they come out, you can see the result. You can see the contract. Medicine is like education or like peacekeeping. What does it mean to keep the peace? Peace is a metaphysical concept. How much peace has been kept? How do you measure how much peace has been kept? How do you know that the lesson you gave the kid now on math is going to help them become a financial banker or not? You don't know. How do I know that I told you to diet and impact your cholesterol and it makes you live 5 years longer and reduces your stroke risk? Well, how do I measure that? How do I pay for that? And so we get into these weird things. Oh, well, time units and RDIs, and you talked about cholesterol. Click, 50 cents. You measured the blood pressure. Click, another 75 cents. It becomes absurd. And so now that's getting into the nitty gritty of payment, but that's where I would push back on. I don't think it needs to be an argument between the all the way free market, this is a commodity just like buying a new set of tires, versus, oh no, therefore we need the state collectivist approach. There's many things in life where the tool of the free market isn't as useful as it is for buying other things. But that doesn't mean we need the government to save us. I hope that didn't offend you guys too much, but that's where I am right now.
I'm hitting cancel right now.
This podcast will never air.
Right, exactly.
No, it's interesting. I'm sure Michelle, we should. It's too bad we're at an hour level, but in my muddled mind, it's such a complicated thing because you have struggle with what you would like to do, what is that North Star, and where you are and how to get there. It's complicated by the populations you're in and what will be acceptable to them anyway. But it's funny, like I always kind of end up in some utilitarian world when I try to explain to people why if you say Hayekian or a much more free market world than we have now, meaning basically extricating the government from making any payment decisions, I end up trying to convince people by saying, hey, it'll be net better. Because of course there'll be, in that system, which doesn't have this safety net assurance system given by some magical third party, that system will have certain misses and holes, and that's been used, unfortunately, to powerful effect.
Right.
Of course, some of them have been fabricated, but they've been used for powerful effect to create this sense of need for this construct in the populace. And it's very hard to argue against that. Michelle, of course, is
no, I agree. I agree. It's difficult, and the problem, it requires really a lot of imagination, if you will, because in a way, if you talk about the people, the underserved currently, the underclass, if you want to use those terms that sociologists use, it's a particular class that in many ways is the result, the product of socialistic policies that are longstanding. Some of them have nothing to do with medicine, but nevertheless, they're there, and therefore you have these inner city problems that seem to be really overwhelming, and it seems to be hard to imagine how well-meaning citizens would even begin to deal with those problems. But yes, in a way, if the solution that I want is really it goes back to a different culture. So it's a different culture. It's a different way of viewing the world, a different way of viewing each other, different way of conceiving of what life is about. Accepting inequality, not trying to to make inequalities persist, and not being self-interested, but understanding that inequality is in human nature, and that the best way to deal with it is to allow people to, to give people the freedom to go about and help one another and so forth, and find the resources to do that, unencumbered by policy that is, in fact, by itself, the way you describe it in your book. I mean, it's clear that it's unjust, and it's brutal, and it ends up being brutal. This attempt to equalize everything ends up being brutal and dehumanizing and undignifying, and all these things. So it's really, so so again, the underclass that we live with right now, that we're concerned about, is actually, in many ways, as far as I'm concerned, a product of this mentality, this really brutal mentality that creates people with persistent difficulties that otherwise, in a different, a more humane system, would have a way of seeking help and finding help, and be reachable, more reachable than the way it is right now.
Yeah.
So it's not a practical, because, again, politics has to do with the here and now, and how do you go from A to B. But that's what that's
I,
how I
I
view
think
things.
I think you could offer. So I think, and yeah, I read a lot of American political commentary as well. And although I love the politicians that you've had that really focus, and in Canada we've had a few too. Thank God we've had them, but that focus on tax cuts and deregulation. I think if we define, if I can say this here, the conservative movement that is about tax cuts and deregulation, it fizzles. It fizzles very
Hmm.
fast
Hmm.
because it doesn't apply to people's real life. How do tax cuts and deregulation help me when I'm bleeding on the side of the road? And so we need people within healthcare, us right here, to think hard and long about how can we provide great care for those who are most vulnerable. And okay, so let's start with the people who don't have the mental capacity to ever get a job. They're disabled. Well, of course, someone's got to help them. And how are we going to? I don't know. We're going to have a collectivized insurance plan or a government insurance plan, but start with the fact that I think we would agree that we don't want people just left to starve on the side of the road because they can't get food and they have open ulcers, and no one believes that. But yet, if we talk about Hayek too soon in our policy discussions, and without addressing that fact up front, that we have a deep abiding care for the most vulnerable around us, that's our first job. And certainly the socialized medicine approach, the literature is it's in inarguable on this point, that the lower socioeconomic class people in our system right now in Canada have a much harder time accessing care. They get less care and they get worse care. And there's no debate on that. Everybody knows we need to do better. And so to think that going to a Canadian Medicare approach to get better care for your most vulnerable is going to help, it won't. It won't. We've proved it to the world. It does not help. So we need to do better than that. So I think if we start with principles and say we believe in helping the most vulnerable, and we believe in freedom, and thank God we believe in excellence. I'm so glad that there are some geeks who love wonderful um, iPhones, because then I get to pick up these things much cheaper than they ever would be. I don't know anything about them. I just know that they work a heck of a lot better than my BlackBerry did. Well, the only reason this happens is because someone was crazy enough to keep spending thousands of dollars for the latest model. We need that in medicine too. And what happens essentially is we let you guys do that. You spend high price for the latest model of the iPhones, and then we steal the old models from you and provide it at the bedside in Canada, right? Drug research,
Sure,
everything. And then
sure.
it's a fact. That's what we
Right,
do.
right.
Our R&D is dead in Canada unless it's government funded, and then it's very, very narrow. And I'm not saying we don't pioneer on anything. We do good work here, and we do provide great care much of the time. But as a system or approach, come on, we can do far better.
Shawn, we have to finish by talking about the COVID situation in Canada and how socialized medicine is coping with it. Give us maybe 5 minutes of what's happening on the ground there, and to what extent you can blame or not blame. I mean, we want to be fair. the current difficulty with the fact that you have a socialized medicine system?
Okay, so great question. We just published a COVID Misery Index, so your listeners can go and check that. It's a COVID Misery Index published by the Macdonald Laurier Institute. It's where I'm a fellow there at their think tank. I didn't write the paper or set up the index, but I was consulted and sort of on how it was designed. They break down misery. They say that suffering from the pandemic, it needs to be broader than just talking about case counts and deaths. So we look at the impact of suffering from the disease itself. So the number of people, number of cases, number of deaths, number of ICU admissions. Canada has done quite well, as have many other smaller countries. So smaller countries, less densely populated, often got off a little easier when it comes to total number of cases. Our excess mortality, though, in the 15 years and older group from non-COVID causes are actually quite embarrassing. We've had much higher mortality, and I think it's due to the lockdowns, but we're studying that as we go. The second big bucket is to look at how we responded to the pandemic itself, and I'll unpack that in 1 second. The third bucket is the economic response, and we can talk about that if you want. Canada performed very poorly there as well. However, the states did poorly as well, so we could talk about that too if you want. But when it comes to the actual response, we were very, very vigorous on our stay-at-home orders, school closure, border closure. Eventually, we closed our border when people stopped thinking that it was possibly racist to close borders. So that was a bit of an embarrassment there. But once we did, we were very rigid on all of the policy tools available. And to be clear, every country around the world, developed countries, has the same bucket of tools available, same policy tools available to respond to this. And yet some countries have done very well. They've been able to control the disease, not be too stringent on their responses, and not pour so much money in that they'll be paying for it for 2 decades. The trouble in Canada, and I've written a number of articles about this, is we had to go over the top on our stringency, at least I argue, because our system was so had no resilience. So for example, in Canada, we have 2.5 acute care hospital beds per 1,000 population. In Europe, they have 4.7 on average. Germany has 8. I believe Japan has between 11 and 13 beds per 1,000 population. In Ontario, we even have fewer. We only had 1.5 acute care beds per 1,000 population. We have about 15 million people in Ontario. And so our system is threadbare every winter, December, January, February. And I worked in acute care for a long time, sat at the medical advisory committee, sort of the highest level medical committee in the hospital. And we'd say, oh, do we have to cancel surgeries? Do we have to, what are we going to do? We're overrun with flu patients, right? Influenza every year, seasonal flu. And so now we've got COVID as an excuse to shut everything down. Well, at the very peak of wave 2, the very peak, we had 1,600 admitted patients in the province of Ontario. So it sounds like a lot. We had up to 400 ICU patients. They weren't all intubated. Well, in 2020, the government added 3,100 beds. 1,500 of those beds were ICU beds. So at the peak of wave 2, if we took all the COVID patients in the whole province and put them into one gigantic new COVID hospital, it would be half empty. And the ICU would be 70% empty. And yet everybody's saying the system is falling apart, we're collapsing. Well, certain pockets, yes, we had, it was bad. Well, set up a field hospital if that's the case, Scarborough and Brampton. Don't shut down the whole province because you're trying to protect a failed system. We could get into the number of beds. So in Ontario, we have around 25,000 beds right now for our 1.5 per 1,000 population. If we had the average of the European system, so 4.7 beds per 1,000, we would have around 68,000 acute care beds. So there's part of the argument to say that our response is way out of proportion to the level of disease. I would argue that we should respond based on our resources and the level of disease in a particular community, match resources and disease. So that's one issue, but there's a whole nother separate argument to say that our system is also threadbare to begin with. So it's been challenging to stick handle between those two issues. On the one hand, we're way too small for what we should be, but on the other hand, we're using COVID as an excuse to justify far greater intervention than I think it merits based on the actual counts themselves. So I don't know if that's enough to chew on. Or
Yeah, no, I mean, but it's interesting that you were able to augment capacity very quickly, or the system, because that's the point that sort of Anish has been making, throughout the year, that the U.S. has a lot of redundancy, and it can quickly increase capacity because we do so much. Because I mean, the profit motive is greater, to some extent, is greater in the U.S. than elsewhere, and that sort of thing.
profits everywhere.
Right. But you were able to materialize, or to make extra beds materialize, ample bed materialize. Um,
Well, well, again, what is a bed, right? A bed is essentially a nursed bed.
right.
So if you have a nurse that you can attach to a bed, now you could also change your ratios. Maybe you're 6 to 1. Now we go to 6.5,
Mhm.
beds to one nurse. What kind of bed is it? An ICU nurse, ICU bed is a 1 to 1. So you start parsing down into, well, we didn't build new hospitals to open those beds. We just opened up some beds that weren't open before in hospitals that already had the space there. So there wasn't a capital expense to open those new beds. Whereas if you're building military hospitals, there is a capital expense. I think I said offense, but anyways, a capital
Mhm.
expense to build those military hospitals. But again, they're not permanent. Um, the way we do it in Canada is we try to shut down as many beds as we can, and we try to run our hospitals at 98% capacity or higher. And as you guys know, according to the flow scientists, anything over 83% capacity, according to queuing theory, decreases your flow. And so in Europe, they try to run 78 to 85% capacity. Maybe they'll go as high as 90%, but they never run at 100, 102, 105%, which is just to say you have more patients in your hospital than you have nursed beds. And so that's why we have hallway medicine. Right before COVID hit, the town of Brampton, large town in Southern Ontario, declared a state of emergency, unanimously voted at their town council a state of emergency for hospital overcrowding, hallway medicine. And then the very next week we declared war on COVID, and it just, okay, well, whatever. Now we're focusing on this one risk, and we're going to use worst case scenarios. We're going to throw out all our other disaster plans and just write new disaster plans about this one bug with an infection fatality rate that's very low. I better stop. I'm going to get canceled here.
No, it's all good. But to be fair, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the numbers are bad. It's hard to know. I mean, I don't see any system having done particularly, that can take credit for doing better than others. I mean, there's so many variables. Anish is throwing his hands up in the air.
We allowed massive outbreaks take place in the United States so we could get these trials done, right? I mean, if you didn't have massive outbreaks, if you didn't have protesters in the street burning things, congregating,
You're
if you
talking
didn't
about
have
vaccine
individual
trials,
Americans that said,
right?
we will not shelter in basements. America took one for the global team, which is why we
Yeah.
got a vaccine in 11 months. All right. Otherwise, we would have to wait for Brazil and India to be having their epidemics in order to get a phase 3 trial done. So, United States,
So some countries did do better. Canada currently has given out 16 doses. I just checked April 3rd. New York Times, actually, of all places, is a great vaccine tracker right now, and we've given out 16 doses per 100 citizens. The United States has given out 47 doses per 100 citizens. Usually, we're 10 times smaller than you, and so in this case, it's embarrassing how much smaller we are. And then in Israel, they've given out 113 doses per 100 citizens, and they lead the world right now in their vaccination program. But that's only one measure. I mean, we have to look at all the other measures that I think compile to give us a sense of suffering around the world. And some countries have done much better. So Norway's done better, Sweden's done better, Switzerland's done better. Spain and Canada have done terrible. Actually, on the COVID misery index, we are currently, Canada is worst in world response. The United States is number one right now, just based on the data feeds we're using. I wrote an article about that just last week too. And it's getting a lot of attention because if there's one thing Canadians want to be smug about is the fact that we're so much better than the Americans with our healthcare system, which again is this myth, right?
Mm.
I mean, so every time anyone gets really sick, I'm going to the States. I'm going to Buffalo to get my MRI. Well,
You
the
are
myth is over.
you are welcome for your vaccines. Actually, you should be thanking India for the vaccines that you're importing. Well, but you don't spend a lot on healthcare, so therefore you don't have any factories that make vaccines.
We chase people away with regulation. Go away, pharmacy, go away.
Shawn, that was great. Before we part, it'll be on the show notes, but can you tell us your URL? It's your great blog. You're very prolific, and I want to encourage everybody to
Oh,
go to your
thank you
blog.
so much. It's ShawnWhatley.com. And I apologize. I've only been blogging about once a month now because I'm writing so much for newspapers and the think tank and elsewhere. But yeah, I really appreciate you telling people to check things out. The book is doing quite well. Unfortunately, we don't have the hard copy available in the United States, but you can order it directly from the publisher, Optimum Publishing International, and they'll send it to you free shipping. So you could check that
Great.
out. But
We'll put that on the show notes. When politics comes before patience, by Shawn Whatley.
Lovely, Shawn.
thank
Thank
you,
you so
Michelle.
much.
Thanks so much.
Good to see you guys.
Yep. Bye.
Take care.